Well, this is going to be a slight departure here, a little bit more general topic. I really think this video will be kind of short for me. And that is addressing the issue of the Confederate flag and whether it's racist or not. And I don't see this as a particularly pressing political issue. I think that for those who really care one way or the other have essentially segregated themselves. So yeah, there are people uh, usually in the deep south or someplace in the south who feel very, very strongly that one way about it, and there are probably people in urban centers in the north who feel very, very strongly the other way about it, and never the twain shall meet, or rarely, and so it's not a big issue. But I think it's interesting for uh, for a reason that I think escapes a lot of people, although probably not most of my subscribers. Uh, really prompted me into this is a couple months ago. A friend of mine from school who is black, but he's Nigerian black. His parents were from Nigeria. I think he may have even been born there. So his experience as an African American is somewhat dubious, but he was complaining that he doesn't understand why anybody would think of the Confederate flag as anything other than a totally racist and offensive hate emblem. And there's no way it could possibly have anything to do with tradition or anything like that. And first of all, this guy's understanding of history is the kind that omits, enormous swathes of reality to generate a sympathetic narrative, which I guess we all do to one extent to another, but at least, make an attempt. Like the Civil War was not fought to end slavery or to end racism. There were abolitionists in the North. That's not what made it happen. Lincoln's first inaugural address, among many others, basically he reaffirmed repeatedly that he wasn't going to attack slavery. It is true that there were a lot of very racist people in the South who believed in slavery. It is true that some of them really thought it was the most pressing political issue, and it's true that some of them at least, rebelled because they were worried about what would happen to their slaves. And, the cliched caricature had actual historical precedents. There were people actually like that. And there were people who, even if they weren't like that, sympathized with that, but there are a lot of people like that in the North. But for someone to say, I think that it represents tradition of my homeland, which actually there's not a small number of blacks who feel that way about the flag. For someone like me, as much as I might not like the South for any number of other reasons, and I think I could critique it in a lot more thorough way than just your average liberal who is being politically correct, I do hate the federal government an awful lot, and to raise up arms against it and to secede, which is a totally legitimate thing to do, is something that I sympathize with. But it has to be mentioned that it's a flag, and the point of a flag is to imbue it with symbolism and ideology and all kinds of other things. And so its purpose, they don't have definite objective meanings. They're whatever people want to put it into them. So my friend is not wrong when he says that the Confederate flag is racist, because if he wants to see it that way, the flag is not going to contradict him. And if someone else thinks it stands for honor and tradition and homeland, they are also not wrong. What I thought was interesting was the fact that he would be so willing to condemn the Confederate flag and what it stood for, and yet willingly and eagerly say the Pledge of Allegiance to the Stars and Stripes as opposed to the Stars and Bars whenever prompted. Because if the Confederate flag is racist and aggressive and hateful, which sure, why not? Sure it is, then the flag of the United States government is, I don't know, 100 times worse, something like that. First, it has to be remembered that just in terms of quantity, the Confederate government only lasted from what? Did it start in 1860 or 1861? One of those 2 years. I think they formally seceded in 60, maybe in December. Someone's going to call me out on that. But they were done by 1865. So what, let's just be nice and say 5 years. Well, how long had slavery existed in the United States prior to that? Well, since its inception. As long as there's been a constitution, as long as there's been colonies, almost. Not quite literally. The first slave, I think, came to Virginia, was sold by some Dutch merchants in 1619, so that would make it 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, but before any other colonies were founded. So pretty much right from the start. But yeah, the U.S. federal government flag flew over decades and decades of slavery, not quite a century, but nearly so. The slave trade, something that or at least the international slave trade, something that the Southern flag never stood for. And numerous other depredations against the fugitive slave law. Uh, when a person who had escaped bondage was arrested by a federal agent and taken into custody or whatever, there'd be an American flag right there. Over the judicial system that reinforced slavery. And I actually brought this up in the comments to this guy, and he thought he had a. Oh, he's a nice guy, so I don't want to characterize him as some there's a degree of antagonism that there wasn't. But he said, well, the flag I pledge allegiance to doesn't have that many stars. And I said, yeah, it has more stars. And how did it get them? By genociding the Indians and the Hawaiians. I mean, how did the federal government... I'm not politically correct at all. In fact, I hate political correctness to the point where I'll actually say things that I would normally not say just to get a rise out of the people who, I don't know, flaunt it or think it's normative or think it's a good argument. But the history of with the Native Americans is not as one-sided as we're led to believe. But when you analyze it, really, there's kind of two. There's the non-government and then there's the government interaction with the Native Americans. The regular society, the American settlers, they didn't love all the Indians, and it wasn't all hippies and everything. And there was violence, there was murder, there were posses, all that stuff happened. But there also was a lot of commerce and a lot of intermarriage. I wanted to say interbreeding, intermarriage, a lot of getting along too. But with the government typically had explicit policies, especially after the Civil War, to basically exterminate all the Indians. I mean, literally to exterminate them all. Or to throw them into concentration camps. I mean, literally concentration camps that we're supposed to believe are the most evil things you could do to a person, right? Well, the U.S. government flag flew over all that. In addition to all the slavery, in addition to interning the Japanese. And I'm just picking the politically incorrect things. I'm not picking the things a serious libertarian would upset, I don't know, income taxes or property taxes or the Civil War. I mean, waging a war against the South, killing, 50,000 civilians. Lincoln flew that flag, overthrowing journalists in prison, even Congress people. What is his name? Vandergraff, there was he was from Ohio or Indiana, I forget. Anyway, he threw him in prison, almost arrested a Supreme Court justice. This isn't about Lincoln, though. This is about how stupid it is to think the Confederate flag is evil, but the U.S. government flag is good. It's the flag that vaporized Japanese people who were begging to surrender, basically. Actually, mostly innocent people who had no control over what their government was doing. So I think it just says, I think it really does demonstrate the degree to which people are brainwashed, because any objective observer, because he had to admit it, as soon as I said it, he was like, oh man, he has a point. But it just never occurred to him. We always see the evil in other states. I mean, we can all criticize the Germans and the British Empire and the Japanese and I mean everybody, since the Confederates tried to leave, we can really halt on them. But instead of objectively assessing the federal government and saying, "Well, they've at least done as bad as everybody else," and depending on the metric you use, even worse, it's I pledge allegiance to that flag. and I think that they're great. And I really, although that people don't think of it like this, that it is very similar to worship. It's very analogous. If it's not strictly the same thing, it's awfully close much of the time, and sometimes it is the same thing. There's a video. It's from a movie, and there's a Hillary Clinton-esque character, and she gives a speech, and it's called like the Liberal Manifesto, and she refers to herself as worshiping in the chapel of democracy. Blech. But even though that was fiction, there are actually people who believe that. And I don't know how many times I've just been told, well, that's not democratic, or that is democratic, and that either invalidates or validates whatever it is being discussed. And it's just, no, you can't just cite, that's like saying, because Zeus says so. No, that's not an argument. Or the Bible says so. And I don't like to rip on Christians because it's politically incorrect, but, that's not an argument. And to say, because democracy says so, is not an argument. So, Confederate flag, sure, you can call it racist. You can call it not racist. It's a flag. That's what flags are for. That's why they exist. But anybody who is getting in a snit about how bad the Confederate flag is and all that represents clearly has a blind eye turned towards the U.S. government flag and what it represents, all the terrible things it's done, all the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who died under its bombs in World War II. That's actually a very interesting story, because I know some Germans. I'm friends with some Germans. They are all libertarians, I believe. And it's funny because, well, not funny. I would talk to them, and they have this really, it's a very rare attitude you find among nationalists. Not that my libertarian friends are nationalists, but that they're glad that Germany lost World War II, and they're glad what Americans did to them, what the U.S. government did to them. And there was actually a concerted effort, it was part of the Marshall Plan, part of the U.S. government policy to re-educate the German people after World War II, to denazify them and to deracify them, but also to give them a huge guilt complex. And it worked. I mean, it worked brilliantly. And there's a book about it, and I have it. Unfortunately, it's in German, and my German's not good enough to really get anything from it at this point. I think I actually made a video where I showed it. It's literally called like character changing or brainwashing or something like that. But yeah, the U.S. government was just killing hundreds of thousands, millions of people. I mean, it killed what would be the entire populace. Like if I think in the Civil War there were 4 million slaves in the South. Well, the U.S. killed more, like about that many people in World War II, civilians. I know how many people died in each country roughly. I don't know how many of them you could chalk up to this or that country. But if half of the Germans and half of the Japanese were killed by Americans, which is, I don't know, certainly possible, I don't know, that's literally the case, that would be 4 million. Of course, then you add Vietnam, that's a couple million more. I've heard it referenced, although I don't know the details, that basically we wiped out North Korea in the Korean War, like that they napalmed literally the whole thing. I don't know how true that is. Honestly, I don't know about that. I've heard people who I respect say it, but I don't know the details. But I mean, we just go on and on and on. The Indians, the slaves. It's a pretty sorry record. America's a great country, but not because of its government. Its government is terrible, just like governments everywhere are terrible. So that's how I feel about it. And to the extent that the Confederate flag competes with and or thwarts the evil of the U.S. federal government, then I like it. So that's it.